Building a company over 34 years that I sold for over $100 million taught me that managing humans was messy, emotional, irrational, but absolutely critical. And I can't really talk about the skills that I learned in managing employees while building the company unless I talk about the things that I learned prior to starting my company, because that was the base. And it started with my first official job at a grocery store. And I did really well at that grocery store, and I rose to an assistant manager. I got promoted to be an assistant manager at 17 years old. And I didn't know much, and I was definitely learning on the job. But one thing that I learned really critical was that when you become a manager, that power can sometimes go to your head. And you've really got to be more humble as you become a manager. And I didn't do that. One thing that I really messed up on was I started dating the employees that I managed. Now, there were a lot of young girls that worked at this grocery store. They were checkers and whatnot. And once I got in some power, I abused that power. And I utilized my power to influence and some of these girls to date me, and that created a tremendous amount of drama. And it also created a tremendous amount of untrust from a lot of the employees. The employees that, watched this and they saw me interacting with those girls and thought that they might get some preference over them. Well, to make a long story short, I was fired from that job just for that reason. But what a great lesson. The next management job I had, was at a Popeyes Chicken. I was an assistant manager at a Popeyes Chicken, and I was determined to be a great manager at that Popeyes Chicken. But I thought that being a great manager was demanding absolute perfection. And since most of these employees were minimum wage employees, I didn't do a lot of listening to them. And I thought that their first responsibility was to listen to me and do exactly what I said. And I lost touch with those employees. I was a hard worker, but I was not a good manager. And one night, I had about 20 employees reporting to me as assistant manager, but one night I had a crew of about 7 to 9 employees. And they all got together and they walked out on me. They were so mad at me. And they wanted to send me a message. And all that was left was me. And I got through that night, but the next morning, the owner manager was there and he fired me. And he told me, he said, "Hey, Frank, you're a good worker, but nobody wants to work for you. You're just an intolerable manager." So, learned a great lesson there. Now, the next job I had in management influence, people skill learning, thing that I had was when I worked at this auto repair shop gas station it was a DX. And I worked there while I was going to college. And it's a great thing because I had an owner manager there that really taught me some great lessons about how to manage. And he had some really long-term employees there. He had probably about 15 employees, small company, but they were extremely loyal, extremely hardworking, and what a great atmosphere there was. And I really followed what he was doing. He was demanding, but not critical. He used a tremendous amount of positive reinforcement, and he had a lot of trust, and he listened to his employees. And when I say trust, he allowed us to really not have any bosses. I mean, we just knew that we needed to come through for him. We knew what our jobs were, and we didn't have to be managed because he trusted us. And what a great influence that was. Well, after I graduated from college, I went to work for another company, the last company that I'm going to give you an example of the things that I learned, people skills that I learned. And this particular manager owner, it was called American Canvas. And it was the last company I worked at prior to starting my company. And it was a great lesson also. That manager owner was similar to the manager of the DX, the owner of the DX. He gave a lot of freedom. He had a lot of positive reinforcement. And he had one other good thing that he did. He had more vision, a lot of vision and hope for the future, and a lot of focus on growth for that company. And I noticed that there was a little bit more excitement and a little less tendency for anybody to want to leave that company because there was just a lot more excitement there. But there was one thing that he did that I took note on, and it was demoralizing for a lot of the employees. And that was, he would talk negatively about certain employees behind their backs. And he'd even criticize and put down employees that had even like physical deformations, or maybe they were overweight, or maybe they limped or something. And he would make fun of them behind their back. And that would get out every once in a while, and it really hurt the morale. So I vowed that wasn't going to happen at any company that I would start someday. Now, after I started the company, I believe that those things that I learned at those 3 previous companies were a great base for me to start a company, especially as I was hiring employees and building that employee base. And I think that's a big reason why, we had very little turnover when I started that company for several years. And really the entire length of that company, we had very little turnover. But one thing that I struggled with, especially at the first of the company, and it got better over time, was I really struggled in controlling my anger. And that would cost us sometimes, because employees would get scared, or maybe even their spouses or their family would not like, hearing what happened, and they'd even influence that employee to not stay. So I learned over time that to try to control my emotions, my anger especially, or delegate to employees that can control their anger. One thing that I was really good at, and our company was really good at, was listening to our employees. And that people skill was extremely valuable because it identified certain things that I absolutely know had an impact on keeping employees, retaining employees, and improving the morale. One of those was health insurance. By paying attention to the employees, we experimented with all different types of health insurance, but we learned that it didn't pay off to have cheaper health insurance, because not only did the employees complain about bad health insurance, but their spouses and their family members complained about bad health insurance. We paid attention to that. By listening to those employees, we were able to identify that we needed to have the best insurance and health insurance, and that's what we focused on. Another thing that we did a great job of listening, and of course I learned that a lot from my working at my DX, the auto repair shop, as well as American Canvas, that last job that I worked at. I learned that by listening to employees, we listened to the employees as a management team, we would identify things that were creating emotional issues within the company. A lot of times those were little small things, almost like a rock in your shoe, right? And let me give you some examples. Let's say chairs were broken, office chairs or anything that someone was working. We'd get those fixed. We wouldn't let those drag out. Or maybe a bathroom stool wasn't flushing right, and we'd identify and we'd get that fixed. Or door handles weren't working. Any equipment, computer equipment especially, software support. Those things, by listening to the employees and jumping all over and getting those things fixed, had a big impact on allowing our employees to have a lot of confidence in the management, improve the morale, and of course, improve the productivity. And I'll give you a funny one, even things like smells. Sometimes, there might be a bad smell or something. And we knew that would create a problem. If it's something I didn't want to work in, then I knew it was employees didn't want to work in it either. I think that also, by listening, had an impact on our change to having a lot of our employees work from home instead of work at the company. And that came as a result of experimenting with the employees, working with the employees, and getting feedback from them. And we learned over time that employees, the office employees, of course not the operational employees out there dealing with customers, but the office employees, we learned by listening to them and wanting to make sure that they were taken care of emotionally, that would help improve productivity. And working from home helped a lot of people, because we learned from the employees that things like smells they didn't have to deal with anymore. They didn't have to buy nicer clothes. We learned that by working from home is going to save a tremendous amount of gas and auto repair, auto expenses. So that was a big benefit, and it was a great people skill that we learned. Another thing we learned, people skill that we learned, and this was a tough one, because sometimes you'd have employees that would continuously fail and you might have to fire them. But every once in a while we'd have an employee that was a really, really great employee, and then all of a sudden something strange would happen and they'd not be a good employee, not be dependable, or have some failure, big significant failure at the company. And we learned that if we could just have some patience with that employee and work with that employee, most of that time that we did that, they already had a proven track record of being a great employee or a great manager. If we would just work with them, we could maybe get them through that situation, and then they'd end up being a great employee. And that happened many times. And let me give you an example. We had one employee that was struggling with, gender identification, and we worked with them. They were able to, get a lot of counseling, a lot of help, and they ended up being a great manager for us. We had some managers and some employees that would go through horrendous divorces, and they would act irrationally as a result of that. And we learned that if we could just work with that situation, have some patience, that eventually they'd be a great employee. And we had many examples of that. Now, sometimes you might have to demote them into, no longer being a manager, or maybe have them have more time off, work with them on that. But by working with those employees and listening to those particular issues, we found it was extremely beneficial to our company as far as morale and productivity, and of course, reducing turnover. Now, there's one particular thing that's kind of a higher math people skill that I learned. It wasn't a direct impact on the management of the employees, but it was really my management. I learned over time, by keeping the company focused and not doing too many things, that created less stress in the company. Because over those 34 years of running the company, sometimes I'd get the company unfocused and we'd have to learn a whole bunch of new things, and that would create some potential conflicts between the management and the employees, because customers would have problems as a result of us creating more things to do. So I learned a higher math skill was keeping that company focused allowed us to have better management, better people skills. There was another thing that I learned, and this came in the final 5 years of the company. For most of the company, we had really high growth, and the high growth created a lot of opportunity. And some of these employees that have ambition, kind of like I was when I was younger, the ones that have ambition, they want more challenges. They maybe want management if they're not management. Or maybe they want to move to another city and they like that opportunity and that excitement of going to a new city. And that's what was happening for most of our company. But as we started to slow down, I noticed that the lower growth, we started to lose some really good employees. So growth, another higher math way to improve the morale, improve the people management skills, the human management skills, just because of having a higher growth rate. And that was even one of the contributing factors for me selling the company, that I noticed that growth rate was also impacting the employees and the employee morale, and of course, losing some higher performing employees. Now, the last thing that I learned was, it happened after I sold the company, and I was interviewing or talking to one of the ex-employees, one of the leaders at the company. And I asked them, I said, hey, what do you miss about Fellers, working at Fellers? Because they had left, they had retired. And that person told me, he said, you know, Frank, what I miss the most about Fellers was we were the leader. And it was just so fun beating everybody out there. You know, it's so exciting being the leader in the industry and winning. And you know, I took that to heart. And my interpretation of that is that leadership has a very positive influence on the management of your employees. It helps the morale, it helps the excitement, it helps the employees feel like that they're winning. Now, in summary, looking back over those 34 years of managing people, managing humans, and all the people skills that I learned, you know, I failed a lot. I really did. I made a lot of mistakes with employees. And obviously I was constantly in a battle to control my anger, but overall we had very low turnover. We had lots of employees in excess of 20 years, some even 30 years. An amazing group of employees. And I trace it all the way back to that job with Popeyes. That indelible mark, that trauma, if you will, that impacted me. Because at Popeyes, I learned that you can have a great brand. Popeyes was a great brand. They had a great product with that spicy chicken that was, you know, you couldn't hardly, there was lines of people trying to get it. We had all kinds of capital, an exciting entrepreneur that was running that company. You know, a lot of things working at that company, the best equipment, the best locations. But if you don't have your employees, like when I lost that crew because they didn't want to work for me, you can't succeed. And that's the thing about my company that I built, and the human skills that I learned, people skills, was my employees, even though I failed so many times, they knew that I knew that they were absolutely critical to the success of that company.